My name is Sue Burgess, the Director of Public Programs, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. As a place of remembrance and storytelling, I'd like to honour their deep connection to memories and stories. The shrine was dedicated 90 years ago as a memorial to honour the service of the First World War veterans, and today we remember all who have served and continue to serve in the defence of Australia, our values and our way of life. Please join me in a moment of reflective silence as we remember them all. Welcome all the child internees from the Dinera and Queen Mary and their families who are with us today. It is truly an honour to have you here. I'd also like to thank our event partners, the Duldig Studio and the Dinera and Queen Mary Association, for joining us today and for their support in developing this program. Before we get to the program, a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure you turn your phone to silent or off so as not to disturb the presentation, which is being recorded. And if you need the bathroom during today's presentation, please exit through that door which is on your right, my left, and it's just around the corner in the hallway. And in the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow me because I'll be out of here first. Today we gather to reflect on the stories of the internees of the Dinera and Queen Mary, 85 years on from their arrival to Australia. More than 2,000 refugees, many escaping Nazi persecution, were transported to Australia aboard these ships. Though they sought safety, they were labelled enemy aliens and sent to internment camps. Among them were artists, scholars and thinkers whose creativity went on to enrich Australian life and still does in lasting ways. Yet a chapter of history often overlooked is the experience of internment itself and the lasting impact it had on the generations that followed. Their story also offers important lessons for us as we reflect on what's happening in the world today. This panel is an opportunity to honour their experiences and acknowledge the enduring impact of their legacy. It is my great honour now to hand over to Dr. Seamus Spark, who will be convening today's conversation. And joining him is Professor Joy Demusi, Eva de Jong Duldig, Professor Tonya Eckfield and Kate Garrett. There will be time for questions at the end of the panel, so please hold on to them until then, and please join me now in giving our speakers a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, and a warm welcome from me to everyone here. I can't resist a small aside. My interest in the Dinera and in the Queen Mary, and indeed my connection to many of these people here, is through Ken Inglis, the great Australian historian. Ken was perhaps best known and produced a lifetime of remarkable scholarly work, but is perhaps best known as the historian or the scholar who explained Anzac to Australians. And his work on Anzac and on the shrine and places remains absolutely seminal. I think Ken would be absolutely chuffed that we're here talking about two subjects that are of great fascination to him. The Dinera and Queen Mary was one subject, and we're here talking at the shrine, a building that he knew so well. So it's a quite lovely way to acknowledge the 85th anniversaries of the arrival of the Dinera and the Queen Mary in Australia. Before I ask the panellists to introduce themselves, I'd also like to add another thing. This event was conceived to sort of acknowledge, to remember, to celebrate those anniversaries, and well we might. I'm not sure that we quite realise the significance of the timing of coming together to talk about the importance of immigration, to talk about the importance of a diverse, multicultural, pluralist society. I mean, in the wake of appalling demonstrations in Melbourne and in other cities in the last couple of weeks, quite distressing developments in a sort of modern multicultural society. I'm really delighted that we are here to, I hope, affirm the importance and significance of migration and what different peoples and different cultures bring to this country. So we're going to go through some questions today, and then panel discussion, and then we'll throw open to some questions from the audience. But I'd like to begin by asking each panellist to introduce themselves. I'll start with Eva on my right.
Oh. So could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. My name's Eva.
Eva de Jong Duldig. I was Eva Duldig in 1940 when I arrived on the 25th of September at Sydney Harbour on the Queen Mary. Subsequently, I was put into that internment camp, the picture of which you saw when you came in. And it was there that my mother apparently painted the portrait of King George VI. And that portrait has only just come back into my life. For 85 years it has lain somewhere and I didn't know about it. And it brought to me, I was thinking about it and I thought, now, first of all, she must have brought it with her. I can't assume that in September when she arrived until December 1940, she actually had the presence of mind to paint a portrait of King George. So she brought it with her from Singapore. But why did she sign it to tour in 1940? She was showing her allegiance to the crown. She was showing the fact that it was the British and the British Empire at that point which was actually going to be our saviour. And I think she recognised that, and therefore she saw fit to sign that document at Tatura in 1940. So who was I with on that ship? I was with a lot of other families. About 250 of us came on the ship, and among them were a lot of children who became my friends. And the other photo on the screen now before you shows us children on what we called Orange Day, because we were each given an orange and we're all holding our oranges. And some of those people in that photo, I know 3 of us are here today. And that's Ruth and Gracie and George on that photo. Now Miriam is also here, but Miriam was a bit little and she didn't get to stand up for that photo, and she wasn't in that kindergarten class. Those were my first friends, and as you can see, I'm so delighted that they are with me today too, to celebrate 85 years in Australia, because that's what it has been. We have been the lucky people who were able to grow up here in this wonderful country, in the freedom it offered, in the education it offered, and in the environment it offered. So we were the lucky ones. Going on to the next slide. So my dad joined the Australian Army, and that's how our families got out. I was able to go down with my mother to St Kilda and live in a boarding house, and Ruth and George and Miriam would have had similar experiences. And today I'm wearing my father's service medal, which he never saw. I applied for it from the War Memorial, and I thought, well, good occasion to wear it today. But you can see he's proudly standing there as a soldier. And he was I think he was happy in the army. He made friends in the army. These were people who actually helped us. He made portrait busts of Captain Broughton, who you see on the left of the screen, who was the commanding officer of the 8th Employment Company, which he joined together with the other internee soldiers. And Captain Broughton became a great friend who wrote a marvellous reference for my father when my father was discharged for medical reasons later in 1942. And he also made friends with Padre Charles Young, who was really my friend. He was like a grandfather to me. I can remember sitting on this man's knee and singing, "Where is Thumpkin?" And Padre found us our first flat in Ackland Street, St Kilda. He helped my father find his first civilian job. And it is those people, those Australian people, who got us going. And we really were very lucky at that point in time. So that is really the start of my story, and I'd like to now stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Tonya, please.
Well, I'm Tonya. I'm the daughter and niece of 2 Dunera internees, and here with my sister and nieces and nephew today. And we've got that makes, with their kids, 4 generations of the Eckfelds in the last 85 years in Australia. There's a slide at the top here with the date in the corner, 1934, and I thought that was worthy of reflection. If you don't mind, I'll just move out of the way and stand up because then I can see what you're seeing. It's a drawing that I only recently found, so it didn't go into the book. No one knows their destiny. And it's a drawing, a rare survivor, a drawing by my father Reinhold, done in 1934 when he was 12. I think 1934 is a year worth reflecting on for just a little moment. 1934 was when the Shrine of Remembrance here in Melbourne was opened. 1934 was also the year when Hitler became the Führer in Germany, absolute dictator. And in 1934, my father was 12 and made this drawing of his life as it was, with my father bending down with his best friend Alfred, playing marbles, and a typical park scene, a man sitting on a park bench reading the newspaper with his dachshund dog on a leash, a lady feeding the birds, feeding breadcrumbs to the birds, chatting to another lady, a young lady with a child in a pram. And it's a lovely life, and a life that's about to change in unexpected ways. Later, his best friend Alfred became a Nazi, and my father Reinhold was categorised as a Mischlinger Grade 1 and became a refugee. In 1939, Reinhold, my father, and my uncle Waldemar, Reinhold was 17 and Waldemar 21, had already been expelled from their studies, Reinhold from grammar school and my uncle Waldemar from his medical studies at the University of Vienna. Their parents had been forced into unemployment and their sister forced into unemployment because my grandmother worked for a political party and my grandfather, a journalist for a big newspaper, editorial journalist, was a Jewish-owned paper, was closed down, and my aunt worked for a Jewish solicitor, so their jobs finished. There was no future for them, and worse still, with Kristallnacht. My grandfather was arrested, my father was arrested, beaten up, and narrowly missed being sent to Dachau. So they had to go, and they are part of the big Dunera story. The Dunera story is one of migration. It's also one that happens in 5 parts. It starts in Europe, it goes to the UK, it gets on the boat Dunera, the hell ship, the notorious hell ship. It comes to Australia, where all of the Dunera internees were, all of the Dunera men were refugees and others were interned. And then finally with freedom in Australia or back in the UK or where people moved on to resettle. They did make it to the UK it was very difficult to get visas. They made it to the UK in 1939, just before the outbreak of war, but their settled life there didn't last long. In 1940, Churchill proposed collar the lot. That was after the fall of France, and the brothers who were there to quietly working and doing their bit were arrested, put into Belfast jail, taken to Liverpool and interned briefly, and then put on the Dunera for a 59-day hell voyage. You can see 2 images of the brothers there, comparing them to the typical middle-class Viennese boys that they were in the top right-hand corner. Their condition on the boat, my father's identity card with his photo taken on the boat. In the one, they didn't have access to any of their luggage or clothing or anything, so in one outfit of clothing for 59 days and completely ill-treated, so with his prisoner number around his neck. And my uncle endured a terrible beating which left him almost dead. And there's a drawing by my father of my beautiful uncle after the beating. He was unrecognisable. They arrived in Sydney, finally, after 59 days on board the the Dunera under awful conditions on the 6th of September 1940, and most of the internees were then had a long journey, 24 hours, Seamus, to get to Hay, in the middle of nowhere really. And Dad made a drawing in 1941 of Camp 8 where he was. If you stand up hard against the inner third fence, then there's seen to be only 2 fences left between you and the outside. So that was the scenery. Thanks. I can do the next slide. Yeah, thanks. They remained in internment, and in 1943, after 5 lost years, the 2 brothers were able to get out of internment. Reinhold went to the army with where Eva's father was, the 8th Employment Company. You can see him there in his army uniform, and today I'm wearing his medals. He never would have worn them here, be too shy, but I'll wear them for him today. And he served 1,356 days in the army. That's 3 years and 7 months. And Waldemar was able to get out of internment by going to war work. Both brothers decided to settle in Australia, and the family was able to regroup, so that's part of the immigration story. Their mother and sister were able to join them here in Australia in 1949. And for my father, who was quite just a teenager when he left Vienna, he was perhaps young and a little bit more resilient, and he'd lost sort of everything, but he was younger and could sort of remake his life. He became an architect, married a local Melbourne girl, and formed a family. And the tall girl is here in the audience behind the camera there, and the little one sucking her thumb is standing up here talking to you. And then an ominous newspaper cutting from December the 7th, 1959, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So not all stories turn out well, and many of those with more to lose, like my uncle, who's really just his wish in life was to complete his medical training and be a doctor, could not to really re-establish himself here in Australia. Too many bad things had happened to him. And I've recorded their story in No One Knows Their Destiny, which some of you here today have read already. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tonya. And you'll note, of course, Tonya's book's there, and Eva had a slide up of her book as well, and they're both wonderful books available outside. I really recommend them. Joy, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be on with our wonderful panellists. So my name's Joy DeMusi. I'm a historian of migration and refugee history. My story is quite different to Eva's and Tonya's. I've got a photograph there, or a picture of a book I wrote about Greek migration, which is my background. And the photo is of the Nazi occupation of Greece in the early stages of the Second World War. This was in the part of Greece that I come from, which is in the north, and which subsequent to the Second World War there was also a Greek civil war which took place. So roughly between the years of 1939 and 1949, a good 10-year period, my family endured war and civil war in its most brutal and violent manifestations, as I know both of you have experienced that as well. And I sort of raise this because, of course, this is what led to the migration of my parents to Melbourne in the late 1950s. My father came out here in 56 and my mother in 57, and were part of the massive wave of Greek migration after the Second World War, unprecedented, of course, in Australia's history. Over 200,000 Greeks came as migrants, but you could say probably refugees from that experience. They settled in Melbourne and took jobs as cheap labour in this country. And as you would know, Greece and Greek migrants have really shaped this nation on many levels. My interest in this topic obviously is personal, but I'm also, in this book, I explore a few questions, and I guess I wanted to raise them today. And it's of great interest to me what happens to previous experience when people leave their country and come to another country. What memories do they have, and what memories do they repress? What memories do they carry to the next generation, and what memories do they wish to not carry to the next generation? And so in this book, I undertake a number of oral histories, particularly around war memory and violence, actually. And what do you tell the next generation, and what do you screen out? And I thought it was really interesting, the sort of choices people make about what they tell the next generation in a new country. And so in my own personal case, my mother made it her pursuit in life to never forget the experience of war and violence in her experience growing up. My father was the opposite. He was keen to forget. And so we had extremes in the family, as it were. So much so that on my father's side, it's only come to light very recently through one of my PhD students, can you believe it, that one of my uncles fought on the communist side in the Greek Civil War, which was completely unknown to our family. And so my PhD student has unearthed this wonderful archive about this uncle of mine who was very pro-communist and active, and actually never returned to Greece after that activism. So sometimes it takes somebody else to tell your family's story, which, you know, is as a historian really quite intriguing to me. But this question of, you know, what is handed down and what isn't, I think is a really interesting one in terms of migrant communities, in terms of refugees who come to this country. Some people want to tell the story, some people want to forget it. The other part of that, and both Eva and Tonya raised this implicitly, I think, is how do we tell the migration story? You know, is it one, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about this, you know, is it one of great success? Is it one of pain? Is it one of negotiation? Is it one of endless negotiation between cultures? What did we do with language? And I know Kat's going to talk a bit about this. There are endless challenges, and I think the migration story is complex, it's multidimensional, and I really think that, you know, there are so many aspects we continue to explore about how people, quote unquote, adjust to a new environment, which is multi-layered, and I think we need to embrace that and consider that and think about how complex those transitions are to a new culture. There are many successes, of course, but does that hide a whole range of other challenges, I think, for every migrant community coming to this country? And Seamus raised the most recent challenges to migration and to the recently arrived groups. You know, Greeks have been here for a very long time. But yeah, coming back to, you know, what language do we use? How do we talk about it? Because obviously it has enriched this nation, but have we always understood the challenges for migrants? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. There were some fascinating questions there, which I do hope to return to. Once Kate's introduced herself, so I'll ask Kate to introduce herself. Just to make sure, because Kate may not say this herself, I've worked with Kate for about 11 or 12 years, and she's a superb translator, which I suspect she wouldn't volunteer that information, but she's a very talented translator and has been a wonderful colleague for a long time.
Thanks, Seamus. That's very kind of you to start with. So I also have a picture of a book here that I wanted to start with, and there's a couple things that I want to get into with this. First thing I'll say is that this isn't my book, but I felt like it was appropriate when I was thinking about how to introduce myself here today. To start with this book, because for me this is the book that kind of brought me to the Dunera story, and it is Oswald Volkmann's Im Stachelkreis. So as Seamus mentioned, I am a translator. That's how I sort of came to the Dunera story. I work from German to English, so that's kind of my perspective on this story. And like Joy, in that sense, I have a bit of a less personal connection to the Dunera story, but I have been working with Seamus for the last, is it already 11 or 12 years? And in that time, I've had the pleasure and the honor of being able to read, translate, transcribe a number of different Dunera documents. So that's things like memoirs, that's letters, that's first-person accounts, and then there's also things like poetry. And as I said, this is one of the things that I really started with. So, for example, I've translated the Dunera Diaries of Uvar Radok, which was published a couple years ago. Another project that I've been working on recently is about the translation of the art historian, who some of you may know, Franz Philipp, translating his personal poetry. And then there's the translation of Oswald Folkman's poetry. This is one of the first projects that I worked on ever with Seamus. And so I feel like it's very appropriate for me to return to it here today. So this book, if you're not familiar with it, is a book of poetry that's written, there's both German and English poems in it. And I've seen it, in various sources, I've seen it described as doggerel. So they're these sort of like jaunty, often humorous poems, but many of them really sort of get to the heart of what many of the internees felt like the Dunera experience was. So I've seen them quoted in various sources. And I also think that it is interesting and important to bring up this book here today, with a view to sort of this idea of legacy. And I think it kind of maybe touches a bit on what you're saying here, Joy, about how we tell these stories going forwards. So Oswald Folkman is, as I said, he wrote these poems that really, in many ways, many internees felt like got to the heart of their experiences. You know, I have met internees who still kept that book of poetry. There was a limited number of them, and you know, obviously this image is from a museum collection, but others sort of kept this book in their private collections. And I have done a lot of research into Oswald Folkman, so we know that he came to Australia, he was interned here, and then he returned to the UK, and we think that he returned to Germany, but to be honest, we don't really know what happened to him. So I've done quite a lot of research into Oswald Folkman, and together with other colleagues, and there's very little information about what happened to him later in life, and what he did with his life. And so he has this legacy that looms really large over the Dunera story. You know, his poetry is repeated, it's cited in multiple different sources, and in fact, he has a poem that shares the name of our panel here today, His Majesty's Most Loyal Internees. And yet, nobody really knows what happened to him. And so, at the end of it, he sort of just went on to this quiet life somewhere in the world. And I think that that's kind of something that I personally am really interested in about this panel, is that kind of duality of that legacy, and exploring more of that here with everyone today.
Thank you very much, Kate. I'd like to pick up on something that Joy mentioned, and I'll ask either Tonya and Joy to speak to this. To what extent did your parents hold to their past identities? Did they actively seek new Australian identities? And also, did your parents shield you from the past and its pain? I think I might start with you, Joy, and then work backwards. And I'm interested in, what was the childhood language in your home, given what you said about your parents?
Yeah, thanks, Seamus. So I grew up with no English. So our language was a mixture of Greek and Macedonian, although that Macedonian rapidly disappeared because of the politics of that, speaking that language, and I can go into that a little bit. But we spoke Greek, which is interesting in itself, right? So there were, at the time, you know, very few facilities or opportunities for my parents to speak English or learn English. And, you know, they're working through jobs, that usual sort of, you know, profile. And so it was a kind of, it fostered, and I'll be interested to hear other people's experience of this, it sort of fostered a sort of two-world situation. The world at home, which was very heavily Greek, and, you know, there was no English, and then the world of school, where I eventually, you know, did learn English, and the outside world, so to speak. And there's quite a bit of work done on that tension. How do you manage those identities? How do you manage those expectations and behaviours? You know, how do you behave as a migrant internally and then externally, you know, assimilate? And of course, I grew up in the assimilation period, if I can use that word. So there was a constant negotiation. I think that's how I would describe it. You know, in terms of Australian identity, I don't think my parents were that interested in cultivating an Australian identity at all. I mean, I think what emerged organically was what was emerging at that time, which was an Australian Greek identity, completely inarticulated and completely not a thing. But in fact, in that era, those 40s, 50s, 60s period, that's what was happening. A new identity was emerging, and they were contributing to it sort of unknowingly, if you like. You know, they weren't actively so. And just on the question of stories, well, this is, as I said earlier, this is of great interest to me because I think for my mother, and it's often a gender-specific issue, right? You know, mothers, women often are the carriers of the history of the past. And my mother did not shield me or my sisters at all. And that in itself has its issues, I think, growing up with some brutal descriptions, but, you know, how she wanted to convey what she saw and what she experienced and why we were in this country was very important to her. And I guess as adults we had to negotiate that information and those experiences ourselves. But as I said earlier, my father was of the view that it was time to completely disengage with that and reinvent and come to this country and start fresh. He, though, again, wasn't that concerned about becoming Australian, but certainly on the question of what you carry to the new country, he was quite adamant. No political tensions and allegiances, and you know, involvement in such things, and really starting the slate. So you know, his family history was a blank sheet to us, totally mediated by my mother, and hence this long lost uncle who was a fighting communist who was never discussed. I'll leave it there, Seamus. Yeah.
Could I ask, just very quickly before moving to Tonya, I'm not sure when your father died, but was he aware of the direction your work took in your career, and did he disapprove?
He passed away in 2000, so, you know, it's a very long time ago, and in fact, before I got into a lot of this migration history, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because he remained, as my mother, who's still alive, remains illiterate in English, so they couldn't read anything I wrote, which again raises questions about, you know, how generations emerge and how they interact together. It's a very oral tradition that I grew up on and with, and it continues because my mother's not literate. So the short answer is they're aware to the point of, you know, it's fantastic getting to they were very aspirational. Education was a direct route to, you know, better jobs and better opportunities. And, you know, they loved history themselves in that sort of oral way. But, yeah, it was way before I got into this material.
Tonya, could I ask you to speak on this? I know you have a very particular and profound experience of pain in your family history, and I sort of wonder the extent to which your father discussed that or shielded it from you.
Well, yeah, it's a big question. I think we were shielded from it, and I think that's probably fairly common amongst the children of Dunera internees. There are some who know very little, almost nothing about what their fathers went through. But nevertheless, the Dunera community was the milieu in which we grew up. So we were surrounded by Dunera internees and experienced all the joy of that because they were wonderful people. But there always was a bit of a shadow as well. And I'd say that Dad didn't really talk about it much. It might be sort of small references, but Mum was the one who, I think, in my case anyway, as I was old enough to understand some things, she would pass on information about what had happened to Dad or some of the really awful things that had happened to many of his friends. But that was only a bit of the story. We were also lucky to have our grandmother and aunt, and I used to sit with my grandmother a lot, and when I was little I'd say, tell me stories about the old days. And she said, but I've told you all the stories. I said, tell me again. And the stories fell into two parts. They'd be the stories before Hitler and the stories after Hitler. So that was enlightening. And Dad also was he wrote, he drew, we had photographs. So there were sort of, and we had documents. He had a lot of documents which were very rare survivors amongst the Dunera community. So there was evidence there to refer to and sort of understand more, and we were lucky that Dad lived to 95, and that meant that it was such a long time together that there was the chance to really learn more. And later on, so this century, Dad and I together translated his things that he'd written back in the 1940s about his wartime experiences, and translated those from German into English. And there were other things, letters and so on, that we translated together. And that gave me the chance to talk to him and really understand in more detail. But that was only the part of the story, because there were two Eckfeld brothers, and Waldemar had died in 1959. So I only have a very small memory of him as a small child. And he didn't leave, he didn't write or draw or leave a lot of records. So his story was a bit of a blank, except, what I learnt from my father. So that then led to a kind of more recent deep dive into archives and all sorts of things to really, and to look at what we did have about him to understand his story on a, use the word profound, on a profound level of really what did happen to him and how what became of him transpired. So it's been a long road. I can tell you that writing the book was intense, and I felt it was while I was writing it that I was certainly with them, living through every minute of what they went through, and that was quite harrowing. And I was only just sort of finding out about it and putting it together. I didn't have to really live it. So now I feel I have a good understanding. I think that all of the Dunera boys, whether few of them might not have admitted it, but I think they all were traumatised. They went through trauma. I think they all, like a lot of returned soldiers too, had PTSD. They suffered from that, and then I think there is intergenerational trauma. I know that I've heard from other people in the next generation have told me about their feelings, and I think that's why it's important to have events like this today, where we can remember, we can commemorate, we can honour, and come to terms with what happened and get to a better place about it. And I think recognition by the Shrine of Remembrance is a fantastic thing. Thank you very much to the team here at the Shrine.
I think just before I throw it away, the question of Dunera and trauma is really a fascinating one, and it's one that's been very much affected by the Holocaust. There is a wonderful quote by a man called Kurt Lewinsky, who was part of Fleur, the furniture company with Fred Lowen and Ernst Roddick. And I found a quote in a letter he wrote to a friend that said, until 1947, I thought I'd had a horrible time in the war. And then I met my wife, who was an Auschwitz survivor, and I never spoke or complained about my lot again. And there's that sort of real tension about some Dunera men have sort of taken that frame of reference. And
Others
and
had it
won't
worse.
talk. Yeah,
Others had
won't-
it worse. And the words I left out when I said trauma, PTSD, I should have said and survivor guilt. Yeah.
And it's a very big thing in sort of Dunera memory. And I mean, Henry Mayer, perhaps, the very well-known Sydney scholar, became a professor of, I forget exactly what his chair was in at Sydney, but he was perhaps the strongest in this view, and he would absolutely not hear of anyone on the Dunera having had a hard time. And he was a Dunera boy himself. And he said his argument was that on the relative scale of things, we won the lottery. And to me, it's a very difficult position, because I think you can still talk about trauma.
You can call it a story of luck or not luck, because it's both. And certainly there were a lot of other people who were equally, had all of those attributes who were killed.
Yes.
And there were people who died in battles as well, in warfare. So once the Dunera boys got here, it was a better place compared to whatever else it could have been. Yeah.
Eva, could you bring us a Queen Mary perspective, please, on these questions?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you to Tonya for raising many of the issues which really were common to me as well. But firstly, of course, I'd like to second your comment about thanking the Shrine for having us here today, because I think that's an amazing thing for the Shrine to do. The difference between our group and the Dunera is in one sense the same, or it's the same, but it's different, because our group was made up of families, and those families mostly came out in midlife, or at least my parents were in midlife. A lot of the Dunera people were young people, not all of them, but a lot were young and could start again. Our parents came out after having experienced a cultured life in Europe, and then further different culture in Southeast Asia and Singapore. That gave them a different perspective on what they were coming to, but the first thing they had to do was find a way to make a living. And that was paramount. And in the case of my parents, my cousin used to say, oh, but your parents were lucky because they were artists and they could take up their profession here without having to redo their degrees. And that, to an extent, was correct, because we have here represented in the audience a large group from the Huppert family, and Ergen Huppert, George Huppert's father, George was my little friend in the camp when we arrived. In that photo, he was in the front with me. Well, Ergen Huppert had to repeat his pharmacy degree from scratch, and he was a doctor of pharmacy in Europe, and there were many like him. So my parents, in one respect, yes, they were fortunate not only that they could pursue their careers, real careers, well, certainly as teachers, not so much as earning a living from their art, that didn't come at all, but they could teach. But also the fact that they had this profound kind of interest in art meant that I think it was their saviour, because it gave them a passion and took them away from all the hurt. And as I was growing up, I never heard about what had happened in Europe. It was not until I got to university that I actually understood what had gone on and how the rest of my family had perished. Because the one thing I did know as a little girl was that it was just Mum, Dad and me, and nobody else. And no grandparents, nothing like that. So it was a question of having to sort of assimilate, and I went to a Church of England school, and then, of course, sport was a saviour. This country and sport, and in my case, tennis. But those were the days when sport was really the thing that you did as you were growing up and so on. There were other issues, of course, that come into this, and I like the way, Tonya, you raised the question of your father not only having a lot of documents, but also writing things down, documenting things. Now, I didn't know what was in the house that my parents lived in when my mother died. That was back 50 years ago now. And it took me the best part of the 45 years it took to write Driftwood for me to find out what actually was in my mother had saved. She was quite amazing. She had saved all the documents from Europe, all the documents from Singapore, and on top of which there was also the wonderful works of art and the furniture and everything else that somehow by a miracle had arrived in this country, and that I was surrounded with as a young child and really didn't know the history of till very much later. So I had all these things, and that is really the basis of the book, and of course the basis of the Daldic Studio, which I hope those of you who haven't yet been, come and see. Thanks, Seamus.
When we were working on the Dunera volumes with Ken Inglis, the first volume was finished just before Ken died. And the very last thing we had to do before submitting the manuscript, as a promise to Ken, and again with the second volume, was do a word search and make sure that the word contribution didn't appear anywhere in the book. And it was not because Ken knew very well that Dunera and Queen Mary Internees had contributed to this country, but he didn't like the question being framed in that way, or the lens that we look at sort of migrants and immigration in that way. And so we had to make sure the word didn't appear in the book. I sort of interested in the panel's perspectives on that. I mean, on the limits of sort of blanket interpretations and sort of what those interpretations can disguise. And I might start with Kate down the end if you're happy to speak on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's kind of leads into what I began with this idea of the duality of the legacy, because I really see, for example, someone like Oswald Volkmann being very almost a divisive person in that sense, because he is so well remembered within the Dunera community itself, and in a sense so forgotten by history in a greater sense. So I think then there's also, I think one of the big problems with this is that it does ignore, for example, pain and suffering that we might see in the background, and I hope Tonya will speak to this a little bit more in a moment. But for example, if I think about a person like Franz Philipp, he was a very well-known art historian. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with his name. And he never spoke about the past, so he really fit into that category of people who chose not to speak about it. I think there's a quote from Dunera Lives, something like, "Not even a drink could loosen his tongue," from one of his former students. And I worked very closely translating his poetry for a paper in the upcoming book, Fault Lines. And in that poetry, you really see this incredibly sensitive and introspective young man. He wrote those poems from the early 1930s until the 1940s. In that time, he sort of went from being a carefree 16-year-old to being imprisoned in Dachau and then deported to Australia. And you see that hurt changing in his poetry. And of course, you don't necessarily see that in his career and his success as an art historian. And the other name that kind of jumped to mind when we started talking about the idea for this panel is a man named Jack Kaczynski. and I interviewed his son Michael several years ago, quite a few years ago now, I think it was before COVID. And for me, Jack Kaczynski and his story is the sort of archetype of the idea of someone who kind of just went on to live a normal, good life in Australia. And Michael told me when I interviewed him that at some point when he had been submitting documents related to getting reparations for his father, there was something in the documents that he had gone through that indicated that he might have been headed for a life as a lawyer in Europe. And during his life in Australia, he worked in construction, he worked as a greenkeeper at a golf course, and his son Michael said, I can't imagine him having been a lawyer. And yet he still lived here, and he still came here, and he still had a good life. And so I think to bring that back to what Seamus has asked about, I think it's a very, it's a very relevant question. I think, what is sort of a good life or what makes it worthwhile, right? And I think that Tonya perhaps can have something to say about this idea of the duality of success on the one hand versus not.
Yeah. What was interesting, one of the many things that was interesting, one of the many things that was interesting in writing the book No One Knows Their Destiny was that it was about, apart from it being a family history, it really it stands much more universally than that. It's the story of two brothers going through the same events or the same circumstances at the same time and having completely different responses. And I like to think that when people read the book, they ask themselves, well, they can see the two different responses, and that they ask themselves the question, and I think that people have been doing this when they read, what would I do? And I think you do what you can, and it will be different for everybody. I think people do their best.
Absolutely. It's interesting, I've spoken with several other Dunara descendants who have sort of found themselves reflected in that book because they also had the father and the uncle on the Dunara, and they sort of see that right in front of them, potentially, maybe not as starkly, but yeah, they do sort of ask themselves that question.
Yeah, does that answer your question? Good.
Joy or Eva, would you like to sort of comment on the limits of blanket interpretation?
Yeah, I think it sort of goes back to what I was sort of raising before. How do we talk about these stories, right? I mean, at one level, success is an easy category. Here we all are. But at another level, we know it's far more complex than that, and it's about the pain, the suffering. But also, many migrants did not stay, right? They returned after the war. And a project I'm involved with two colleagues is to look at those who failed to stay. And it wasn't all attractive, and there were opportunities. And, at one level there were, but it wasn't attractive enough for some to stay for the rest of their lives. And it's interesting to look at that question. Why do people go back after the war when, Europe opens up and so on? And just in relation to the community I know best, which is the Greek community, many did return. There wasn't much to return to, but it was more that Australia didn't deliver. And I guess that's of interest to me. Why didn't it deliver for some migrants? And why did they feel it was better for them, for a good life, to go back, when they had an opportunity? So that also is something we can think about. But just quickly, Seamus, if I may, I think it's a reflection of the times we're in, that we're back to this justification of migration, to the point of saying contribution. I thought we'd all move beyond that. It's obvious, surely, economic, political, social, cultural contribution of migrants to this country, but given the events of the last 2 weeks and the demonstrations and discussions, we kind of are forced to go back to these arguments and, you know, it's an explain. And that explanatory narrative is frustrating because, yeah, you do revert to, well, it's obvious why migrants have made a contribution. But I guess this is a plea to go also into other directions about the complexity of the whole process.
It's a very nuanced.
Yes.
Every story is a different story. And in relation, Kate, to your greenkeeper, I've used the expression a number of times, exile to success, or success to exile, at the two sort of ends of what it can be.
That's also a very interesting point Joy makes, because we're in the habit of talking about Dunera as an Australian story, which of course it is, but only one quarter of the men on the ship stayed in this country. 3/4 left. And we don't really talk about that side of the story very much at all. On that point, do you know how many of the Queen Mary and Internees stayed?
Yeah, that is interesting, and I've thought about that quite a lot. In our case, I would say that 90%, I would think, wouldn't you, Ruth, George? Would you think you would have stayed? Of our group would have stayed in Melbourne, not just in Australia. But then we were a different demographic. We were families, and those parents, their prime purpose was to see us educated well and brought up well, and they weren't looking for advantage for themselves except in that particular way. And I think that's what made them think, well, look, we've been thrown around the world. We started off in Vienna and we ended up in Singapore, and now we're here. We're not going to set off somewhere else at this stage in our lives as well.
Yeah, I think it's something we do need to remember. I mean, reading an account of a Dunera internee recently who came to Australia, took the first possible opportunity to return to Britain, thought his 9 months in Australia was abysmal, despised the landscape and left as soon as he could. And his reactions and feelings were perhaps particularly strong, but it is an aspect of the Dunera story that we tend not to speak about. I'm conscious that I want to leave time for audience questions, so I might just move to one more question of the panel, and then we can go to questions from the audience. So earlier on I mentioned Ken Inglis, the great Australian historian, and he was fascinated by the Dunera and Queen Mary stories. His fascination came from being a young undergraduate at Queen's College in the late 1940s at the University of Melbourne, and Ken was lucky enough to be taught by various Dunera men and sort of rather taken with these different names and backgrounds and experiences, and he never lost his interest in these stories. But for Ken, these stories mattered they didn't matter not as in interesting historical episodes, or not only for that, but they mattered because, or why, or what they could tell us about the present. Why the Dunera and Queen Mary stories mattered for what they could tell us about the present. And so I'd like the panellists to comment on that question. Like, why study migrant and internee histories? Why do these stories matter now?
Just one word. If you don't take, is it on?
Yep.
Yeah. If you don't take notice of history, it repeats itself. That's me.
It's important to remember. And if I was smarter, I could think of some more reasons why we should remember, but I think we've sort of covered them in a sense. We really need to remember and record what we can before these stories are lost. And I think they are meaningful to those of us who have a connection with them, and they are very important stories within Australian history and international history. Unique and special.
Just for a throw to Joy, I had the privilege of interviewing Erwin Fabian, the artist and sculptor, a few times before he died. And Erwin died in 2020, aged 104, still worked until his death. Went to his studio in North Melbourne. And as he got older, he found it harder and harder to do the heavy metal sculptures that had made him famous. And so he started drawing more again. And he drew, and pictures that Kate and I have exhibited, this series of searing pictures. They're really quite confronting, of asylum seekers on Manus and Nauru. And I asked Erwin about this, and he wasn't a man to say much, and he didn't particularly like talking about his art. But he did say, I see no difference between my experience as a young Jew escaping Berlin in the 1930s and the experiences of these men and women and children, mostly Muslim, escaping regimes or looking for better lives now. He said, to me, there's no difference between the people incarcerated on Manus or Nauru now and what I experienced as a young Jew in Nazi Germany. Sort of a quite striking comment that's stayed with me.
Thanks, Seamus. I think, well, just briefly, 2 points, I suppose. One is that the story has defined this country, and it needs to be recognised as such. It has defined how Australia is, how it's developed in the way it has. But just picking up on your point, Seamus, the second thing is, and what we were saying earlier about the latest discourse, if you like, on migration. We never forget, right? I mean, we have to keep remembering in order for it not to happen. And unfortunately, we see the rise of terrible narratives around migration, and even more disturbing, extreme right groups. And never would any of us have imagined this would happen again. But here we are. So ever more is there an urgency to tell the stories that we're telling today.
And Seamus, I was going to tell an Owen Fabian anecdote, because those images have also really stayed with me. But I'll come back to my greenkeeper, Jack Kaczynski, and say that I think that you see those sort of views expressed across the generations. And when I interviewed Michael about this, probably the most striking comment was something he said right at the end of the interview, and he talked about how he's always very wary about people saying something like this can never happen again, because he said it's still happening. It's happening right now. And when he would talk with people about this, was in probably 2020, to give you context, when he talked with people about the refugee crises, and they would say to him, and he would remind them, well, my father was a refugee back then, and they said to him, no, that was different. And he said, my father was an enemy alien. He was an enemy of the government at that time. What's the difference? And so I think that consciousness that we see across the generations, it gives us more humanity, and I think that's the important part of it.
I think that's a nice note on which to answer. Please thank Kate, Joy, Tonya, and Eva.
And Seamus.
And if anyone has any questions, I think just put your hand up, we yell out, and a microphone will come to you.
Just 2 questions. Can we see the picture of the children standing up?
That one.
Yeah. Who
Who's
are
here?
present today?
Front, I'm in the centre front. Next to me is this little boy holding the orange, and a lot of his family are here. Would you like the Huppert family? Up the back, please. And then that's Georgie Huppert, and Georgie Fink is on my left, second from the right. Is that George? That's you, I think. And Ruthie is sort of on his right, and Gracie, where are you?
At the back.
Yeah.
At the top. next to the sister.
Okay, right, with the ribbon? Yeah, well, they're here. I threw it down here. I think she's one of the second rows. Yeah, behind Eva.
Bearing in mind the children, I was interested in what advice parents should give their children from that age in the next 10, 20 years about how they can cope with what they've experienced. Considering the number of images we have of children in current conflicts who are going to experience things.
I mean, I'm not a trained psychologist, but there's a vast body of material now on how to talk to children about past experiences of violence and so on, and how to, deal with, say, I think Seamus mentioned Nauru and the children, if we recall, in Nauru who suffered from chronic depression at a young age and so on and so forth. I mean, I think the point is that hopefully, as a society, we're more attuned to these issues. I think the era we're talking about amongst ourselves, there was nothing, of course, like that. There was less kind of recognition. I think someone mentioned, trauma is not a thing, right? I mean, people didn't talk about trauma as such as a capital T word. It is now, and post-traumatic stress and survivor guilt. Survivor guilt, there's a lot of material on survivor guilt. It's a really interesting category, isn't it? Generational trauma, that time is mentioned. So we have the language, we have the categories now much more than we did, and so I think there is a recognition that it needs to be attended to, as it were, for children who, absorb or take in violence and violent stories, or they themselves experience internment.
And just one little tiny thing there on this little group of children, and that is that we were kind of a catalyst for our parents. In other words, our parents really also concentrated on our welfare, which helped them a hell of a lot. Plus, the government took notice of the fact that these little children were in this camp. And in this chapter I wrote for Statelessness, which is a recent publication, it became evident that the Australian government in Parliament discussed the fate of the little children in the camps in Tatura, and that enabled our group actually to get out more quickly. So there are these things, and as little children, I mean, I was perfectly happy, and I think Ruth and Gracie and George too, probably, we were too small to have all these heavy things coming on us, and we could play and we could go around, and we had good food, and we had our parents there, and our parents organised the camp, and that was the big thing. I've run out, is it?
Oh, any question?
I'm not from the boats, but I was also a daughter of refugees who came as young single people or barely married when they arrived in Australia. And being married to George was an interesting experience within the Jewish community, because it was about the first marriage I knew of was between Polish, Eastern European Jews and German, Austrian Jews. And that's not alluded to a great deal. But the divide was absolute as far as I can remember. I don't think I knew a Viennese Jew before I met George. And the relationship within the Jewish community were not good, absolutely not good. And I was wondering if there's any reason that you don't ever refer to this problem.
Too hard basket.
The only thing I can offer is, so I'm not Jewish, and it's something sort of beyond my knowledge to comment on, but I do know that the Hay internment camps were divided very clearly down east and west lines between supposedly cultured Jews from the west and the unrefined Jews from the east.
We had just as many artists, I can tell you. Absolutely at the same time. What the problem was, I haven't.
In fact, they're not my words. They're
Eva's memory. I mean, I have very strong memories of the remarks that my parents would make about them, and I wondered if she had memories of the remarks that her parents would have about them. I mean, when I said I was going round with George, it was
I
quite
think,
interesting. My father said,
and if I could just interrupt you, I think probably the bigger question is not so much the intermarriage or the relationships between the sects of the Jewish religion, but it is interesting to know how many, I have to say in this case, Jewish people married non-Jewish people as a result of all these things, and that is interesting. And the people who came out of these so-called Mischling, mixed marriages, and they have been equally, I would say, well, I should say that word contribution, equally enriching Australians.
Good choice of words.
Thank you all for a fascinating panel. A couple of you mentioned the importance of education in the parents wanting to give to their children. You've got 3 academics well published around these stories, or 4, sorry. Okay. How have these stories been picked up in the curriculum in Australia, and how has it then transposed into new refugee stories all the way through to Momus and beyond?
I was going to defer to Joy on that one. I don't know that it's particularly been picked up in the curriculum. But
That's a great question, thank you. I mean, I'd have to say, well, a bit more optimistic than that, James. Look, as more publications come out, and as more stories come out, and as more families' histories come out, that gives us literature and material to put on the syllabus and to promote these stories. And I think they're in circulation, and it depends where you look, but definitely, if I can use the broader category of migration history, that has changed significantly over the last 30, 40 years because of all the great literature and continue. And, I always encourage people, write your family history, write your stories, get it down there. So we can hear about it, and then we can teach the next generation coming through. So, I've worked as an academic for a very long time, and I've seen the emergence of that field and change with new material like that we're looking at and discussing today. So I'm very optimistic because there's enormous interest in it because everybody has a migration story, right? Everyone. And so it's about encouraging those stories to come forward. And as you were saying, Jolene, everyone's different. You talk to people in the Russian community or the Polish community or the Sri Lankan community, and I've sort of worked across a number of those communities, and they all have fantastic stories to tell. I should say, just as a footnote, one of the projects I'm involved in at the moment is to try and digitise migrant records. And that's really, really important to make those accessible to everyone. So if you want to look at your family history, those records are online and digitised. Many of them are not in English, so we're hoping to translate them. But it is about telling the stories that have yet to be told, because these records haven't often seen the light of day, people can't speak the language, So I think with technology you might find there's going to be even more accessibility.
I'd say there's a lot of scope in the future, and I hope it all, as you say, all these publications coming to light helps the journey. An interesting thing about my father's writings, one part of them at least, he wrote about his experiences from Kristallnacht to leaving Vienna, and that was a record that he wrote while he was in internment in Heim to Tura in German. 20 years ago, the grammar school that he attended in Vienna, the history teacher there, who's still there, who did a project with his Year 11 students, and that project was to discover what happened to all of the Jewish students who were expelled in the 19s, under Hitler in 1938, and he worked through a government organisation that had the details of people abroad, and made contact to discover the fate of all of the boys who'd been expelled. And from my father's very fine account of what happened in his period of trying to leave Vienna, they retrace the steps and the experience. And that's a project that continues and has continued to grow in all sorts of rich ways. Yeah. So anyway, let's hope for the future that the material's there and ready to be used. And I think a lot of it's relevant, especially amongst the young Dunera boys who are teenagers. I think that's very relevant for secondary age students.
Hi everyone, my name is Miriam Gould, and I wasn't there because I was only 11 months old. This is more a comment than a question. At this very important day, I'd like to cast our minds back as to what it may have been like to be one of those people who were at Tatura. Bear in mind that it was 1940. We did not know that the war would be won. The fear that my mother would describe in her heart the whole time would never abate. No. I have the letters with the censor and the crossings out across the top. I know the fear that was in people's hearts. Yes, they were safe, which surely was the most important thing in many of their minds, especially for the people with the children. But the fear as to what had happened to their families, they lost their families. That was something that would only become worse as time went on. So thank goodness that we found a safe haven here in Australia. We were unbelievably lucky, as we hope many people would be lucky from now on. Yes. But I think we have to also realise how terrible, indeed terrible, these times were. Thank you.
I think there's a few more questions, but the event needs to end, but I'm sure that if you do have questions, the panellists will be happy to answer them afterwards, and thank you very much.
So it comes to my lot, which I'm very pleased, is to thank our panellists today. So thank you, Seamus, our wonderful panel chair, Joy, Eva, Tonya and Kate. I think it's been an interesting topic. I think it is very apt that we're having this discussion and we continue to have this discussion. So thank you for so generously sharing your experiences, your research, and having that discussion with us today. It's a joy to see the journey of the Dunera and the Queen Mary internees told today here at the shrine at this institution, and we're going to have a ceremony later that I hope you'll join us with, but being recognised, and it is so relevant still today as we celebrate the 85th anniversary of their arrival in Australia. And the children, the child internees, which always amuses me, the 5 we have today. Now, who is of the descendant of the internees here today? If you look around you, and now if I ask you who's a descendant of an immigrant, I mean, it's Australia, right? It's our story as well, under different circumstances. So it's always interesting to explore one. I'm just so thrilled that the Shrine has partnered with us. This came at a very interesting time. We were talking about the 85th anniversary and what we could do to celebrate, especially while we have the children with us today. And just then we got a loan request from the Shrine, because there is a little cabinet in the gallery talking about the Daldig family, studio and the Datura experience that you can all wander through, and that's why we're winding you up, so you get a chance for a cup of tea and to see the gallery before the next step. But yes, so Neil Sharkey sent this loan request, and we looked at each other and we said, oh, do you think they'd collaborate with us? Because we are quite a small organisation, and we were collaborating with the Genera Queen Mary, and it happened. So thank you very much to the Shrine, specifically Laura Thomas, the Shrine Production Coordinator, who's worked with us along the way and very diligently. And an event like this does have a lot of emails associated with it, which I was copied on many of them. Sue Burgess, the director, who I'll hand over to soon, and Neil Sharkey for actually loaning those items from us. What else? Behind the scenes, there's also a team with the Genera, but also the Duldig Studio. And then we have our wonderful Erica Chatterton, the sister of Tanya, who's been our videographer today. So thank you again, recording this, which we will edit and we'll post it, so it will be available for you to share with your families through the Duldig, and I presume Genera as well. There are many people here that I could thank. I don't think I saw. We have the Stonington Council does support the Duldig Studio and our programming, so I thank Stonington too. But biggest thanks to Gina Panabianco, my fellow board member, who was doing all the running around from the Duldig side, so a special thank you to you. My fellow board members here today, Andrew Dixon and Anthony de Jong, our treasurer, who's also Eva's son, and then our staff, Melinda Mockridge, who did write the catalogue and curate our Art Behind the Wire exhibition, which we had, and we have some, she'll be in the foyer to ask any questions about that, and also you can buy a copy and she will sign it for you. I hope I'm not putting it in that. And then Stefan Damsky, who's our collection facilities manager, he's here today too, and he'll be near the cabinet if you have any questions about the art that's displayed in the gallery. And then we have our wonderful volunteers, I see some of them around, who are storytellers. And if you do come to the Duldig Studio, and I hope to see you all there's an open invitation, they will take you around. So we have Simone, we have Phil, and we have Wendy. They are the storytellers that will take you around and share these stories. And I guess I would just like to leave it there, and I'd implore you all to keep telling the stories, make them personal, share them, and listen to them, because I think that is what's going to build the empathy and the understanding in our society. So keep talking and sharing and recording the stories. And I hope to see you all at Duldig Studios soon. And I'm going to pass over to Sue Burgess just for the final bit before you can all get to your cup of tea.
Thank you very much, Janine, and I certainly endorse all of those words you've said. And I'll just reiterate that we were really thrilled to be collaborating with you today and talking about these really, really important subjects. Before I get into the last few remarks, I've been asked for any of the internees and descendants to remain here at the end just briefly. We want to get a photograph, and then you'll be free to get a cup of tea. So we'll do the photograph first, but for those of you that are not part of that group, you're welcome to go outside and have a cup of tea or coffee. The books that have been mentioned here today are for sale out there if you're interested or further interested, and there's also a book list as well for further research if you'd like to undertake that. Janine has mentioned about the display in the gallery. She's very welcome to go up and look in there at the conclusion of the talk here. And of course the most important thing at the end of the day today, 4:45 we've got our last post service where we're going to remember this occasion, a very important occasion, the 85th anniversary of the arrival of the Genera and Queen Mary. And of course Eva and some of the others will be out there participating in that service and laying a wreath. So you're all most welcome to come out and join us at 4:45. I apologise for my voice, I am getting over a bit of a cold, but thank you so much once again. We really were very honoured and thrilled to have you all here today, and I look forward to seeing you again, and please enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.